Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere quiet. Somewhere that smells faintly of roasted barley and mountain mist. You'll step softly across wooden floors, worn smooth by centuries of slippered feet. You'll hear the faint clink of celadon cups and the hushed murmur of people who believe that silence can be an art form. We're talking about the forgotten Korean tea ceremonies that once stretched from dusk until dawn. Rituals so gentle, so unhurried, that even the stars seem to pause and watch. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive one. Not because they were dangerous, but because you'd be expected to sit perfectly still for hours while hot water was poured, ever so slowly, into tiny porcelain bowls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who else is half awake across the world, listening to history unfold with a cup of something warm. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin beneath a full Goryeo-era moon. The year could be 1130, give or take a generation. Records were loose then, and the night air doesn't care for calendars. The estate spreads before you like a sleeping poem. Tiled rooftops, walled gardens, and a pond so still it mirrors the sky. Lanterns line a narrow stone path, their light quivering with each whisper of wind. Somewhere nearby, a bamboo flute sighs.
You're ushered to a low pavilion near the water. The host bows, robes rustling like paper, and gestures toward a mat. No one speaks much. In these circles, conversation before tea is as taboo as sneezing during a royal procession. A few attendants move about, preparing trays, each motion slower than time itself. The host begins by heating clear spring water in a brazier. Not boiling, never boiling. True Goryeo tea, you learn, demands a water temperature just shy of a simmer, somewhere around the philosophical concept of almost. A single degree too hot, and the leaves will lose their soul, or so the poets claim. As the kettle hums, you glance around. The guests, scholars, monks, maybe a poet or two, sit in measured calm, faces lit by flickering lamplight. They've likely spent the day debating the nuances of a Confucian text or writing an ode to a persimmon tree. Now they let their thoughts steep like the leaves soon to be poured. Tea in this world isn't a drink, it's an atmosphere. The Goryeo elite prized subtlety, the faint fragrance of fresh ground powder, the whisper of steam rising, the way moonlight ripples across the rim of a celadon cup. You can almost feel your heartbeat slow to match the rhythm of it all. The tea itself isn't like the bright green matcha of Japan or the sweet infusions of China. It's earthy, muted, contemplative. Some leaves were whisked into a thin froth. Others were brewed loose, drifting lazily before sinking to the bottom like old memories. One sip and you taste rainwater, mountain soil, and a hint of smoke from the brazier's charcoal.
Historians still argue whether these midnight ceremonies were purely spiritual or partly social. Some say they were an extension of Buddhist practice, an all-night meditation disguised as hospitality. Others believe they were simply what passed for nightlife before Netflix, a chance for nobles to show off their rare celadon and discuss existential tea foam. One quirky record mentions that during long sessions, participants sometimes composed impromptu verses, comparing their tea to clouds or moonlight. One surviving line reads, "The cup is the moon, the tea its reflection." Another, more honest poet wrote, "It is late and my legs are asleep." You sip slowly. The taste lingers, faintly bitter, but clean, like the afterthought of a memory. The host tilts his head, pleased with your restraint. You didn't slurp, and that counts as cultural progress. You watch him refill the kettle, measure the powder with bamboo spoons carved to the width of 2 grains of rice, and stir with a brush that looks suspiciously like an artist's tool. Outside, the garden hums with nocturnal life, frogs, cicadas, and the occasional plop of a fish breaking the pond's surface. Each sound folds into the rhythm of the ceremony, like background instruments in a very slow jazz piece.
As the night deepens, the pace doesn't change. You notice how everything, each pore, each gesture, is a kind of choreography. Even the way they wipe the bowl rim follows a pattern of 3s, representing purity, harmony, and focus. There's comfort in that repetition. A soft laugh breaks the quiet. Someone jokes that tea masters must reincarnate as turtles because they've perfected the art of moving slowly. You grin, almost ruining the solemn mood, but no one seems to mind. The host smiles faintly, which in this context is basically a stand-up routine. And so it continues. The moon drifts higher. The brazier's coals glow lower. You realize the ceremony isn't meant to end so much as fade, like dawn itself easing over the mountains. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th bowl, your sense of time dissolves. You imagine the first people who ever decided to roast leaves and pour hot water over them must have been equal parts curious and desperate. Perhaps they thought, if we're going to stay awake all night chanting sutras, we might as well do it with a beverage. Tea in Korea was never just about caffeine. It was a bridge between body and thought, a way to make stillness tangible. By midnight, even your thoughts move slower, gliding through the steam. The line between waking and dreaming starts to blur. You sit quietly, gazing into your cup, and it feels as though the moon itself is looking back. For one peaceful moment, there's nothing else. No noise, no history, no time, just warmth and silence, steeped together under the same night sky the ancients knew.
The air cools as the night stretches on, the kind of cool that makes you instinctively wrap your sleeves tighter and lean toward the brazier's low orange glow. The host motions for another pot to be brought, this time smaller, darker, made from clay so fine it seems to absorb the light. The first ceremony was only an introduction. This, he explains with a glance rather than words, is the dawn tea. You don't yet realize how long these gatherings last. In the old Goryeo tradition, a tea ceremony wasn't measured in minutes, but in breaths. It flowed from dusk through the silent blue hours of night until the first blush of morning touched the mountains. The guests never rushed it. Tea demanded patience, and patience demanded tea. Around you, the garden feels different now. The sounds have softened, the frogs less insistent, the wind quieter, the pond half shrouded in mist. The servants return carrying trays of powdered leaves wrapped in silk paper. The aroma alone could calm a thunderstorm. One attendant carefully unwraps a portion and places it in a shallow stone grinder. You watch, hypnotized as they turn the wheel by hand. It's slow, deliberate, rhythmic. The grinding stone hums softly, a sound like distant waves.
Tiny green dust rises into the air, smelling.
The powdered tea is transferred to a small bowl. Nothing fancy, just clay with a faint glaze that catches the moonlight. The host stirs in a spoonful of water and begins whisking with a bamboo chosin. The whisk's thin bristles move in tight circles, quick but graceful, until the surface of the tea turns to soft foam. You can almost hear it whisper. The first cup goes to the eldest guest, a gray-haired scholar who nods with the authority of someone who's spent decades perfecting the art of nodding. He sips, sets the bowl down, and exhales through his nose, a formal expression of deep approval. The host bows slightly. Ceremony satisfied. The bowl moves to you next. You cradle it with both hands. The warmth seeps into your palms. The aroma is sharper than before, grassier, fresher, a little wild. You take a cautious sip. It's bitter at first, then smooth, then unexpectedly sweet, like rainwater over stone. The host watches closely, and when you manage not to grimace, he nods again. Congratulations, you've survived the second stage of the ritual without offending anyone. In the Goryeo period, tea like this was called malcha, literally powdered tea. Historians still argue whether Korea learned the method from Song Dynasty China or developed its own version earlier. Some say Buddhist monks traveling between temples brought the technique across the Yellow Sea. Others insist it evolved naturally in the mountain monasteries, where monks experimented with tea leaves the way modern people experiment with sleep schedules.
One quirky record claims that Goryeo monks believed the sound of grinding tea could purify the mind. It was said to scour away the dust of worldly thoughts. And you can sort of see why. That soft, circular rasp, repeated endlessly, works on the mind like a lullaby. Your host explains, again with gestures rather than words, that the tea for this hour is meant to keep everyone gently awake, not alert but lucid, perched between dreaming and thinking. The ceremony isn't about staying conscious. It's about expanding the night. Beyond the pavilion, the servants are lighting new lanterns. The oil inside burns cleanly, sending faint trails of smoke curling into the rafters. Their silhouettes flicker like ghosts. You notice that every movement seems choreographed, each refill of the brazier, each placement of the cups. There's a rhythm here, invisible but strong, like a heartbeat beneath the stillness. Someone murmurs a line of poetry. Another answers with a pun so subtle you almost miss it. You realize these guests are practicing what was once called darya, the etiquette of tea. It wasn't just about brewing, but about balancing formality and warmth. In those moments between sips, you start to feel the difference yourself. The mood here isn't rigid, it's fluid, like ink spreading on rice paper. Someone laughs quietly, the host allows it. Another guest hums a tune under his breath. The ceremony doesn't break, it just breathes with them. The moon has moved westward now, glinting off the edge of a nearby pagoda. You think about how many such nights have been lost to history. Records of Goryeo culture often burned with its palaces, yet a few fragments survive. Lines in dusty books, sketches of tea sets, poems comparing foam to clouds drifting over Hala Mountain. You sip again, slower this time. You taste the earth's patience, the craftsman's pride, the monk's calm. The tea's warmth unfurls through you like a gentle tide. Somewhere deep inside, you understand why these ceremonies lasted until dawn. It wasn't indulgence, it was endurance of peace, a test of how long people could remain in quiet harmony before the noise of the world returned. The brazier crackles faintly. You look into the flame and imagine the generations that did this before you. Farmers turned scholars, monks turned wanderers, poets who found divinity in the shape of a teacup. You wonder what they'd think if they could see the world now, where tea comes in paper bags and the ceremony lasts about as long as a TikTok clip. Probably nothing. They just smile and pour another cup. The host lifts his bowl, gestures to the stars, and takes a final sip. The others follow, and without a word, the attendants begin cleaning up. The second ceremony is ending, but not the night. A faint shimmer of pale light appears over the mountains. Dawn is thinking about waking up, but just thinking. You breathe in the steam one last time, and the air feels softer somehow, as though time itself has been strained through it.
You sit on the floor, the world shrinking to a thin thread of silence between you and the tea. Not the loud, buzzing silence of the modern kind, the one filled with phone vibrations and air conditioners, but a silence that breathes, a silence so complete it feels alive. In the dim room, lit only by oil lamp or morning sun filtered through paper screens, you feel yourself beginning to vanish. The etiquette of the Korean tea ceremony isn't written in words as much as in stillness. Every gesture, every breath, every pause becomes a line of poetry. Your right hand moves first, gently, never too fast. The left follows, like a loyal friend who knows the rhythm by heart. To move too quickly is to insult not just the host, but the tea itself, because here, tea is not something you drink, it's something you become part of. One mainstream historical fact that always surfaces in this setting: by the Goryeo Dynasty, roughly the 10th to 14th century, tea rituals had already become deeply woven into courtly and Buddhist life. Monks brewed it as part of meditation. Kings performed it to symbolize purity and control. The ceremony wasn't about caffeine, it was about clarity, about holding the chaos of the world in one porcelain cup and daring it not to spill. You reach for that same stillness now. Your mind wanders for a moment to the world outside the tea room, the noise of the markets, the sound of carriages, or maybe even the ghost of a Seoul street centuries ahead, filled with neon and horns. Then, like a good host, you gently escort that thought out the door. There's a saying that survives in a few dusty records: the host must first boil the heart before boiling the water. You imagine that means you must be calm before the steam rises. Maybe it's metaphor, or maybe some long-dead monk really did mean to preheat your emotions. Historians still argue whether this phrase refers to emotional composure or to an actual pre-boiling purification step. Either way, it's poetic enough to make you smile into your cup.
You lift the kettle with deliberate slowness. It's heavier than you expect, not just in weight, but in meaning. Someone centuries ago probably used a kettle like this one. They too were trying not to tremble as they poured. Their guests, seated cross-legged and serene, watched the flow of liquid like watching time itself being poured from one vessel to another. You realize then that this ceremony isn't about tea. It's a language, spoken without words, answered without sound. You communicate with glances, with the tilt of the wrist, with the steam rising in question marks. If you spill even a single drop, everyone knows you've rushed something inside your own mind. A quirky tidbit slips through history. During certain ceremonies, hosts were known to deliberately make one perfect mistake: a single tea leaf left out of place, or a drop intentionally allowed to fall.
This, they believed, invited humility and kept the gods of pride at bay. It's oddly comforting to think that perfection was never the goal, even in a ritual built on precision. You breathe in the scent of roasted leaves, nutty, faintly sweet, the way autumn smells when it's trying to remember summer. The bowl before you gleams with a tiny reflection of your face, and for a fleeting second, you see yourself as one of those monks of old, wrapped in gray robes, lost in the warmth of the moment. As you pour, the trickle of tea fills the room with its own soft music. The sound is measured, polite, like rain politely knocking at a window, waiting for permission to enter. The guest bows, you bow deeper. Nobody speaks because, in this world, words are considered noise too loud for the company of steam. It's almost absurd to modern ears, isn't it? Sitting perfectly still, exchanging invisible emotions through ceramic bowls? You'd probably check your phone halfway through, or sneeze into the piece. But here, that sneeze would be an act of cosmic rebellion.
And yet, you start to understand it. The magnetism of stillness. The ceremony forces your body to slow down enough that your thoughts have nowhere left to hide. There's no multitasking in tea, no skipping ahead, no playback speed 1.5x, just the steady heat of the cup, the cool air brushing your wrist, and the echo of your own heartbeat pretending to be a drum in some faraway temple. Somewhere deep in that quiet, you feel it. The shift. The air seems denser, like the world has decided to listen for a moment. You don't move. You barely breathe. You simply exist, suspended between the kettle's hiss and the whisper of your own presence. And this is the secret most people never realize about the old Korean tea masters. Their ceremony wasn't meant to end. It wasn't about the final sip or even the first one. It was about being trapped in the middle, in that eternal now where time dissolves like sugar. Outside, you imagine the moon climbing the tiled roofs, sliding across the paper doors. Maybe it's just your reflection trembling in the cup. Or maybe, like those masters of stillness, you finally managed to disappear into the ritual.
The garden wakes up before the people do. You're walking through the morning mist that hugs the royal slopes of Gyeongbokgung, the dew still heavy on the jade-green leaves of plum and pine. The air smells of earth and faint smoke, the kind that comes from low braziers warming the first kettles of the day. Somewhere nearby, a court attendant yawns like a cat and stretches before the endless cycle of brewing begins again. You, lucky outsider, are here to witness what few ever saw, the royal morning tea, the quiet heartbeat of the Joseon court. Steam rises like incense from the copper kettle, and for a moment, you almost mistake the sound of bubbling water for whispering voices. That's because, as every palace servant believes, each kettle remembers the hands that held it, and it murmurs its gossip through the centuries. Historians still argue whether these morning tea ceremonies had any real political purpose or were simply a pretext for the king's own calm, a rare excuse to avoid the thunderous debates of the court. Either way, the ritual became so disciplined it bordered on spiritual combat. Water poured precisely at 75 degrees, the pot swirled clockwise exactly 3 times, then stopped, as though the universe itself hinged on symmetry. You kneel beside the master brewer, his face a map of wrinkles so intricate it could serve as its own tea leaf pattern. His breath smells faintly of barley, and when he speaks, it's as if his words are soaked in steam. "The tea doesn't begin when you pour," he says softly. "It begins when you listen." He gestures for you to close your eyes. The courtyard fades. You hear the tiny crackle of pine wood beneath the kettle, the slow hiss of the first bubbles rising, The fish eyes, as Korean tea masters once called that first stage of water heating.
It's absurdly poetic, but you play along. You imagine the water coming alive, swimming with invisible fish made of heat. Maybe you shouldn't have stayed up scrolling through memes about productivity hacks. This feels like the anti-hack, boiling water until enlightenment occurs. And yet, it works. The longer you listen, the quieter everything else becomes. Tea masters of the late Joseon era treated these moments like training for sainthood. Many had once served as scholars, poets, or bureaucrats exiled from the capital for offending someone powerful. Brewing tea became their rebellion, silent, lawful, and delicious. One of them, Kim Jung-hee, allegedly refused to drink from porcelain because he said the cup was too proud. He preferred plain clay, porous enough to remember sorrow. Whether he ever brewed tea for the royal household is debated endlessly in lecture halls, as if the right teapot could rewrite history. You reach for the small cup handed to you. It's warm, lighter than expected, the pale green tea inside shimmering like sun through water. The first sip shocks you, not because it burns, but because it's so faint it barely tastes like anything. You expected some kind of earthy punch, but this feels like you just drank a polite memory. The brewer chuckles quietly, as though reading your mind. Real tea doesn't shout, it whispers. The king himself preferred such whispers. Records describe him sitting perfectly still as ministers waited outside, all afraid to interrupt the sacred calm. Some historians suggest this morning ritual was really a form of performance, a reminder that patience itself was power. Every controlled breath, every deliberate gesture told the nation that the monarch governed time as much as territory. A king who could wait for tea could outlast his enemies.
Then, with no warning, the peace breaks. A servant stumbles in, panicked, clutching a scroll that drips wax and urgency. You flinch, expecting outrage, but instead the master brewer raises a finger and signals silence. The ritual continues. Even crisis must wait for the water to cool. You can't help smirking. Somewhere, HR departments are taking notes from this 600-year-old workplace culture. Please refrain from interrupting colleagues mid-pouring ceremony.
You can see why these ceremonies sometimes lasted until dawn. It's not that the guest drank endlessly, it's that time lost its footing here. In the records, courtiers sometimes emerged blinking into daylight, shocked that they'd spent an entire night chasing the perfect pour. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal, about a prince who fell asleep mid-ceremony, chin tilted forward, the cup still hovering between lips and dream. Rather than wake him, the attendant simply froze in place until morning light warmed his face. You half believe it. The brewer refills your cup one final time and says, "Tea reminds us we are mostly water, pretending to be solid." You want to laugh, but it's too beautiful. The cup trembles slightly in your hands, as if agreeing. Somewhere behind you, the first notes of a Gayajum zither drift across the courtyard, the strings humming like wind caught in silk. By the time the sun clears the wall, the kettle has cooled, the ceremony is done, and you realize something absurd. You've barely moved for an hour. Not bad for a history lesson disguised as a mindfulness app. If your smartwatch were tracking mindfulness minutes, you just unlocked emperor-level tranquility. You rise, bow to the brewer, and catch your reflection in the shallow bowl of leftover tea. The face staring back looks calmer, softer. You could almost convince yourself you've aged backward. But then your knee cracks loudly, reminding you that enlightenment still has joint pain. The garden hums again. Servants gather teacups like fossils. The kettle is lifted away, and you follow the scent of cooled charcoal through the narrow corridors of the palace. There's more to see, and more history waiting quietly, steeping in the past.
The palace walls are higher than you remembered. They rise like cliffs of stone and memory, their tops lined with the rhythmic purr of roof tiles that gleam under early sunlight. You walk along the shaded corridor that connects the tea pavilion to the scholars' hall, guided by the faint aroma of roasted barley and sandalwood. Somewhere ahead, a low hum of voices ripples through the stillness, courtiers discussing the day's ceremony, debating the proper placement of teacups, as though national destiny depends on porcelain alignment. Inside the hall, you're greeted by a sight that feels halfway between a classroom and a temple. Scrolls hang on the walls, each one painted with a different proverb in thick black strokes. One reads, "Water remembers only patience." Another, "Boil too fast, and wisdom escapes as steam." You can almost hear the philosophers high-fiving themselves in the afterlife. At the center of the room sits a small lacquered table surrounded by 5 scholars. Their robes look like fragments of twilight, navy, gray, a wash of pale silk. These are the king's tea advisors, men whose entire careers revolve around timing, temperature, and the subtle art of political flavor. They glance at you the way academics always do when someone new walks into a debate, politely, but with mild suspicion. The eldest, a man whose eyebrows deserve their own historical footnote, clears his throat. "You've come from the morning brewing?" You nod. "Then you have tasted clarity," he says, eyes glinting. "Now you will taste confusion." The others chuckle, because apparently in 15th century Korea, confusion is a gourmet experience. They begin to argue, not about taxes, not about war, but about which mountain produces the most spiritually responsive water. One swears by Joseon because the streams there sing to the stones. Another insists on Mount Gyeryong, claiming its waters remember the heavens. You're halfway through wondering whether bottled water companies have been missing this marketing goldmine when a younger scholar turns toward you and says, "You're quiet. Which spring would you choose for tea that must outlast the night?" You freeze. He's clearly testing you. You could say, "Evian," and get executed for anachronism, or you could improvise. So you murmur, "The one that flows slowest." The room falls silent. Then the eldest nods, "Ah, a philosopher of stillness." You exhale, pretending you totally meant that. Historians still argue whether these scholarly tea councils truly influenced royal decision-making or if they were simply elaborate cover stories, ways for courtiers to hide real politics inside polite debates about leaf oxidation. Some modern researchers believe coded metaphors were embedded in their discussions. When someone praised a strong steep, it might mean advocating war. A delicate brew could hint at diplomacy. The fact that we'll never fully know only makes the mystery sweeter. The scholars begin preparing their own tea. This is not the serene ritual of the morning garden. This is laboratory work disguised as poetry. One measures leaf weight with a carved jade spoon, another uses a silk cord to test water clarity. They pour in silence, except for the rhythmic tapping of bamboo sticks used to stir the foam. It's mesmerizing, like watching monks play percussion with liquid.
You sip what they hand you, a darker infusion, roasted and nutty, almost like coffee's shy ancestor. Barley tea, one explains. For endurance, not all ceremonies are gentle. It's strong enough to wake the dead, and for a moment your heart sounds like a drum. Maybe that's why the scholars drink it before night-long discussions. It keeps them tethered to this side of reality. One scholar unfurls a scroll. It's a schedule of ceremonies stretching across the lunar calendar. Spring blossoms, summer rain, autumn harvest, winter silence. Each event lasts from sunset until dawn, each dedicated to a theme: gratitude, resilience, sorrow, joy. Tonight's, you notice, is enduring breath. The meaning escapes you, but the words feel heavy with poetry. The elder explains that these gatherings aren't just rituals, they're acts of national memory. Each pour retells a story, each sip a vow. During the Japanese invasions of the late 16th century, monks smuggled tea seeds into remote valleys to keep the culture alive. He says, "Even when the temples burned, we still brewed." His voice cracks slightly, and you feel that tremor ripple through the centuries. The debate resumes. Now they argue about cups. Should the royal ceremony use white porcelain, symbolizing purity, or celadon, the milky green glaze that glows like dawn fog? You can tell this is
A servant appears with a brass gong, softly, struck 3 times. The scholars rise. The sound echoes through the corridors like a heartbeat, calling them to the next ceremony. One of them turns to you and says, "Come, we will show you the tea that never cools." You follow them through the courtyard toward a shaded structure built over a shallow pond. Carp drift lazily below, orange streaks gliding through green reflections. The scholars remove their shoes, and you do the same, stepping onto the cool wooden floor. The air is heavy with the scent of lotus and ink. A single kettle rests over a flame so low it barely exists, a metaphor, probably, for the entire dynasty. They sit. The elder begins another pour, slower this time, his hands trembling slightly, but never spilling a drop. He mutters, almost to himself, "The night is long, but the tea remembers." It's a phrase you'll carry for years without fully understanding. And as the first cup passes to you, you feel it. Not caffeine, not warmth, but something stranger. A hush that settles inside your bones. The same hush that must have filled this pavilion centuries ago when kings sat here waiting for dawn, surrounded by men arguing about mountains and eternity. You raise the cup, the reflection of sky rippling on its surface, and drink. The world narrows again. Not sleep, not wakefulness, but that fragile space between. You think, maybe this is what enduring breath means. The quiet persistence of something simple. Water, leaf, patience, refusing to disappear.
Night arrives, not with thunder or drums, but with a sigh. The sun melts into the western hills, and the palace shifts moods, from gold and noise to silver and whispers. Lanterns bloom like small moons across the courtyard. You follow the scholars back toward the ceremonial hall, where the tea tables are already set. The long night of endurance, the enduring breath, is about to begin. The air inside hums with low anticipation, the same kind that fills a concert hall seconds before the lights go down. Servants glide across the floor, carrying trays of polished cups and carved bamboo whisks. A kettle begins to sing softly on the brazier, its first notes high and tremulous. You can feel the whole palace hold its breath. A bell chimes once. The tea ceremony begins. You kneel on a cushion, the scent of roasted rice and pine smoke curling around you. The elder scholar from earlier sits at the head, his posture straight but not rigid, his eyes half closed, as if listening to something you can't hear. A small jade bowl of tea rests before him, pale green, with steam that dances like breath in winter air. He raises it and says simply, "To remember the living and the forgotten." Everyone follows, cups rising in unison. You take a cautious sip. It's bitter at first, then softens into something floral, almost honeyed. The taste lingers, grassy, ancient, elusive, the kind of flavor that seems to whisper, "You're drinking time itself." For the first hour, the ritual flows in silence. The only sounds are the faint clink of porcelain, the rustle of robes, and the rhythmic pouring of water. Each movement is rehearsed, yet alive, as if the room breathes through every motion.
Historians still argue whether these late-night ceremonies were meant primarily as meditative exercises or as social gatherings disguised as piety. Some say they were philosophical performances, the Confucian elite proving they could out-endure one another in stillness. Others claim the tea meetings were coded salons for dissent, that under the calm swirl of steam, subversive ideas steeped quietly. The truth, like most tea leaves, is somewhere between sediment and mystery. As hours pass, the conversation slowly blooms. It begins with metaphors. One scholar wonders aloud whether tea remembers its original mountain. Another compares the steam to a poet's lost breath. The youngest, still brimming with mischief, jokes that perhaps ghosts attend too, thirsty ancestors who hover unseen, waiting for their favorite blend. You catch yourself smiling. It's strange, being part of something so serious, yet so lightly human. The scholar notices and whispers, "Laughter keeps the tea alive." As midnight deepens, the hall's temperature dips. Someone slides the paper doors open just enough to let the night breeze in. Outside, the garden glows faintly, lantern light trembling on the pond, reeds swaying like brush strokes. You can hear crickets rehearsing their endless symphony. It feels like the universe itself is attending. The elder begins to tell an old story, a legend of a monk who once stayed awake for 7 nights, sustained only by tea brewed from dew gathered on lotus petals. He claimed, the elder says, that the tea let him see the dreams of mountains. Scholars still debate whether that monk actually existed or whether he was invented by later poets trying to elevate insomnia into enlightenment. Either way, the story has a way of making you sip slower, just in case your own tea decides to show you something cosmic.
Between rounds, the scholars perform small gestures of reverence, bowing slightly to the kettle, turning the cups before refilling them. Every act has meaning. Rotation signifies renewal. Bowing reminds them that water was once rain. You imitate these motions, clumsy but sincere, feeling your thoughts slow down until even time seems to steep more gently. One of the servants sets down a tray of delicacies, thin rice cakes dyed in soft pastels, shaped like blossoms. They taste faintly sweet, almost like memories of fruit rather than fruit itself. You're told they're called huajian, flour pancakes once fried with azalea petals. Be careful, the servant says quietly. Too many, and you'll forget the ceremony. You're not sure if that's a warning or a metaphor. The scholars begin a debate about sound. Should silence be total, one asks, or is the kettle's song part of the ritual? Another argues that the bubbling is a form of divine laughter, proof that the tea is amused by human solemnity. You secretly side with the kettle. It's been doing all the work, after all. At some point, your knees begin to protest the kneeling posture, but the steady rhythm of the ceremony makes discomfort seem irrelevant. The air grows thick with steam, scent, and sleepiness. You feel both awake and half dreaming, a delicious contradiction, like the taste of bitter tea followed by sweet breath. The elder speaks again, this time more softly. Teaches endurance. The leaf dies in boiling water, yet releases everything beautiful it has. Would you do the same? It's not a question you can answer, but it lingers anyway, like the faint hum of the brazier.
Outside, a wind brushes through the pines. A lantern flickers. You sense that hours have passed, maybe 3, maybe 6. Time here doesn't walk, it drifts. The scholars now whisper verses from ancient poems, passing the words around like cups. You recognize the rhythm of Sijo, short Korean poems, where the third line always turns, like a sudden twist of thought. One recites, "The moon floats on tea foam, a ghost among mortals sighs. Drink it before dawn forgets us." You'd clap if it weren't so beautifully solemn. The elder nods, eyes glinting. "Good," he says. "Poetry steeps the spirit." Then, in an almost comic shift, one scholar sneezes loudly, scattering the moment. Everyone laughs softly, even the elder. You think, maybe that's the point, that the ceremony holds both sacredness and absurdity in the same cup. By now, your body feels warm, your mind buoyant, your heartbeat synced with the kettle's pulse. Somewhere beyond the walls, the first hint of dawn might already be curling along the horizon. But here, in this glowing hall of whispers and steam, time still belongs to the tea. You look down at your cup. The liquid shimmers faintly, catching a reflection of your own tired eyes. For an instant, you feel like every sip taken tonight, yours, theirs, the king's, even the monks from legend, all flow into the same unseen current. Maybe that's what the enduring breath means after all. Not merely staying awake until dawn, but keeping a small, fragile moment alive, together, quietly, endlessly.
The moon dips lower, and the air outside grows soft with mist. You remain seated among the scholars, your senses tuned to the smallest things, the scratch of a sleeve, the faint whistle of steam, the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the night. The long endurance of tea continues, and now it turns into something deeper than ritual. It becomes conversation, that peculiar, drowsy kind that only arrives when the world has grown too quiet to interrupt you. A young scholar leans forward, his face haloed by the lantern glow. "Do you think tea remembers?" he asks, staring into his cup. "That the leaf still knows the sound of the wind it once felt?" The elder replies with a small chuckle. "If it does, let's hope it forgets the rainstorm." You sense a subtle humor between them, half philosophy, half sleep deprivation. The table becomes a circle of low murmurs. They speak of mountains, rivers, and memory, all metaphors for something else entirely. The tea deepens their thoughts like ink bleeding through parchment. It's the hour where truths emerge sideways, wrapped in metaphor, so that they can be spoken safely. Historians still argue whether these dawn dialogues were spontaneous or meticulously staged. whether the conversations that happened after midnight were genuine or performed. One scholar in a dusty archive once wrote that Korean tea at night was less a drink and more a test of intellect disguised as serenity. Another countered, "Nonsense. It was an excuse to stay awake and gossip about poetry." You suspect both might be true. The discussion turns toward poetry, naturally. One man recites a verse he claims to have written that very moment. Steam rises, reason sleeps, dreams pour themselves another cup. There's a murmur of approval. Another scholar challenges him, saying the rhythm's off. The argument is soft, but it's fierce in that gentle, academic way where pride hides behind politeness. You can almost hear the centuries between their tones and a modern internet comment thread.
You watch as the elder refills the cups again, the motion now slower, more ritual than necessity. The tea leaves are nearly exhausted, but he insists on one last pour, for the sake of dawn, he says. You realize he isn't just making tea anymore, he's weaving continuity. Every refill feels like passing the flame of an idea forward. Outside, the night birds begin their first tentative calls. The lamps tremble as wind sneaks through the paper doors. You pull your robe tighter, though in truth you don't mind the chill. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, bamboo, and the clean mineral tang of hot water. Somewhere nearby, a servant quietly replaces the coals under the kettle so the song never ends. They begin to speak of friendship. One scholar says that sharing tea is a confession without words. Another responds that perhaps solitude is the truest form of tea drinking, because the cup reflects only you. You realize they're not disagreeing, they're balancing, like two sides of a bowl. There's laughter again when someone spills a few drops and another jokes that the floor spirit will get drunk on ceremony. It's small, sleepy humor, the kind that warms the chest rather than jolts the room. You catch yourself smiling again, realizing you're no longer an observer, but part of the rhythm.
One of the older scholars begins a tale about a tea master named Cho Ui, the saint of tea. He lived during the later Joseon period, retreating to the mountains to practice the way of tea as spiritual discipline. Cho Ui's poems still survive, filled with mist and patience. They say he once brewed tea for a visiting prince, the scholar says, and the prince found it too bitter. Cho Ui replied, "Then you have not yet met yourself in the cup." The group hums approval. The joke lands centuries later, still sharp, still gentle. You notice how seamlessly reverence and humor blend in this world. Reverence keeps them awake, humor keeps them human. The younger scholar shifts again, leaning toward the lantern. "Do you think," he asks softly, "that the tea ceremony will last forever?" The elder smiles, that weary, half-knowing kind. "Only if it forgets itself sometimes," he says. It's a paradox that hangs perfectly in the air, like steam that refuses to rise or fall. Historians still debate whether these late-night dialogues contributed to Korea's distinctive blend of Confucian decorum and Buddhist introspection. Some suggest that the dawn tea salons subtly shaped the intellectual temperament of Joseon, a society outwardly rigid but inwardly contemplative. Others think the influence was overstated, that tea merely borrowed philosophy's vocabulary to survive among the literati. You sip again, letting the bitterness coat your tongue. The flavor now feels almost sentient, sharper, quieter, as if it's been listening all along. A servant brings out small paper fans to help cool the tea. You accept one, fanning gently as condensation purls along your cup. The air glitters faintly with moisture. You find it mesmerizing, how something as humble as boiled leaf water could turn into an entire language of feeling.
The conversation wanders again, from moonlight to mortality, from the sound of water to the inevitability of sleep. Perhaps, says one scholar,
The ceremony is just humanity's way of stalling dawn. That earns a ripple of laughter because everyone's thinking the same thing. Dawn means an end. A rooster crows somewhere far away, too early, too optimistic. You sense the faint panic in the room, the way time suddenly feels heavy again. Someone jokes, "Tell that rooster to respect philosophy." The elder raises a finger. Even roosters are bound to ritual. And so the group drinks one more round, this time in near silence. No debate, no laughter, just the slow, respectful clink of cups. You realize the laughter wasn't distraction, but balance. Every cup, every word, every pause has been a careful oscillation between wakefulness and surrender. The tea is cooling now. The leaves, once vivid green, have darkened into something like old parchment. The elder stirs them gently, murmuring something about the beauty of exhaustion. You understand, because everyone here, yourself included, is softly unraveling into that same tranquil haze. The lamps are dimming. Someone yawns without shame. Another adjusts his robe, clearly deciding whether to sleep or simply keep pretending to think. You imagine the palace guards outside, fighting their own drowsiness, unaware that inside, history itself is steeping. The young scholar, his eyes half shut, says, "If tea is memory, then we are all forgetting together." The elder nods, and that, he replies, is how peace begins. The last of the tea is poured. Steam rises one final time, coiling upward like a spirit reluctant to leave. You watch it dissolve into the rafters, into the past, into everything. Somewhere beyond the mountains, dawn begins to stretch its pale fingers toward the horizon. But for now, the tea holds. The conversation lingers, suspended in that hush between night and day. A silence shaped not by emptiness, but by everything that's been said and everything that never needed to be.
By the time the sun has risen completely, you're already far from the palace walls. The streets of Joseon's capital stretch before you, waking in ripples, vendors sliding open wooden shutters, scholars straightening their robes, and the faint, fragrant smoke of breakfast fires curling into the air. The royal tea has ended, but the real heart of Korea's tea culture beats not in gold kettles and polished cups. It breathes in the kitchens, mountains, and tiny courtyards where ordinary people brew their own flavors of comfort. You pause at a roadside stand where an elderly woman stirs something in a clay pot. Steam rises, carrying an aroma that's grassy, nutty, and faintly sweet. "Boricha," she says, "barley tea." You take a sip, and it's simple perfection. No ceremony, no court etiquette, just warmth. It's the taste of daily life. A mainstream historical fact, throughout Korea's history, tea was not limited to the elite. While the Goryeo and early Choson courts treasured green tea from the southern provinces, commoners brewed what was available: barley, corn, buckwheat, persimmon leaf, jujube, chrysanthemum, and mugwort. These herbal teas filled homes long after official ceremonies faded. Even in centuries of hardship, tea remained the gentle companion of the people. You sit beside a well and listen as the woman talks. She describes how barley tea kept families hydrated in summer, how roasted rice tea comforted them in winter. She says, "You drink it, not to wake up, but to stay calm." That line lingers. In a world of battles and bureaucracy, maybe calm was the greatest luxury.
As you wander south, the land opens up into gentle valleys. Villagers hang bundles of herbs to dry from their eaves. In one courtyard, a family is preparing omija cha, 5-flavor tea made from magnolia berries. You watch them crush the small red fruits with wooden mallets, then steep them until the water turns the color of sunset. One sip, and it's tart, sweet, bitter, salty, and sour all at once. Like life, the father jokes, and you laugh softly with him. There's something almost philosophical about it, the idea that tea, even when rustic, carries meaning. Historians still argue whether these folk brews count as tea in the true sense, since most lack the Camellia sinensis leaf. But to those who drank them, that distinction didn't matter. Tea wasn't a plant, it was a pause. One fringe tidbit whispers through rural legend. In remote villages, people once brewed moonlit dew tea, collecting droplets from lotus leaves before dawn and mixing them with dried blossoms. It was said to bring longevity, or, depending on the storyteller's mood, eternal love. The science behind that is non-existent, of course, but the image stays with you. Villagers crouched by ponds at dawn, scooping glimmers of moonlight into jars. Further inland, you find a monastery perched on a misty slope. The monks there drink lotus leaf tea, the fragrance light and almost sacred. One tells you that each sip represents the body cooling the heart's fire. You think back to the royal court, the golden kettles, the anxious smiles, and realize how differently people have approached the same simple act of drinking. And yet there's overlap. Even the humblest tea ceremony has rules of respect. The first cup for ancestors, the second for guests, the third for gratitude. You notice this pattern everywhere, like a shared heartbeat running through centuries of Korean life.
As you descend toward the coast, fishermen warm their hands around wooden bowls of corn tea, brewed thick and smoky. Children chase one another between the boats, laughing. the sea wind mixing with the scent of roasted kernels. Here, tea isn't a philosophy, it's a survival tool against the cold. You pass through the market at Tongyong, where traders shout, birds squawk, and someone's always boiling something fragrant. A man with a straw hat waves you over and offers a cup of chrysanthemum tea, golden, translucent, faintly honeyed. For the eyes, he says with pride, and the mood. You nod. Your vision does feel softer somehow, though that might just be the kindness of being offered warmth by a stranger. You start to see how tea here connects to identity. Every region brews its landscape, mountain herbs, seaside roots, urban grains. It's as if the whole peninsula is one continuous kettle, each community a unique infusion of weather, soil, and memory. A group of traveling scholars invites you to share a drink under a pavilion. They unpack small wooden boxes, each containing a different leaf or root. We debate through taste, one explains, smiling. And sure enough, between sips, they argue, lightly, about which flavor best captures the nature of virtue. You can't tell if they're serious or joking, but it doesn't matter. The laughter mingles with the breeze, and for a moment, time slows to the rhythm of boiling water.
As the evening deepens, the first stars emerge. You find yourself in a coastal village where families are gathered around lanterns. Someone's pouring citron tea, thick with pulp, glowing like amber in the light. Children dip their fingers in the syrup and giggle. You take a sip, and it's pure sunlight, sweet, sharp, alive. Here, tea isn't performed for kings or monks. It's lived. It's the quiet between storms, the warmth after a hard day, the gesture that says, "You belong here." And as you watch a grandmother refill everyone's cups, you realize that the forgotten Korean tea ceremonies never really vanished. They just scattered into everyday life, into kitchens and courtyards where no one needed perfect etiquette to feel grace. Maybe that's the secret you've been chasing since that first moonlit garden. The idea that ceremony doesn't end when the guests go home. It lives on in every act of care, every shared drink, every moment we stop to notice steam rising into the night. A cool breeze carries the smell of sea salt and wood smoke. You tilt your head back, sip again, and feel something ancient stir in your chest. Not awe, not nostalgia, just calm recognition. Somewhere, a kettle whistles softly. Another day, another ritual, another chance to steep the world in stillness.
By the middle of the 20th century, the world was at war again, and this time, sleep was no refuge. Cities glowed with blackouts instead of candlelight. Men carried their beds into trenches, and women dozed in factory corners between shifts. The quiet domestic rhythms that had once defined nighttime gave way to the mechanical heartbeat of total war. When peace finally limped home, so did the soldiers, and they brought their restlessness with them. Across Europe and America, a strange insomnia took hold. The generation that had marched through fire now lay awake beneath the soft hum of electric clocks. Governments built suburbs to cradle them, endless grids of houses with tidy lawns and identical bedrooms, each one a promise of calm. The war had ended, but the noise remained. The drone of airplanes now turned commercial, the tick of televisions in every living room, the distant thrum of a world no longer able to stop moving.
Scientists, too, turned their eyes toward the night. In laboratories, men in white coats began to map the brain's secret tides, recording dreams as if they were signals from another world. Sleep became measurable.
chartable, something that could be studied, managed, improved. And amid all that progress, something tender re-emerged, the yearning to rest without fear. The lullabies returned, the soft lamps glowed, and the post-war dreamers built a culture of comfort: pillows, mattresses, night creams, radio hosts with velvet voices guiding listeners gently toward slumber. It was as if after centuries of conquest and chaos, humanity finally decided that the simple act of sleeping safely was its own kind of victory.
But peace, like dreams, never lasts forever. By the 1960s and 70s, the world's engines were roaring again. Cars, factories, neon signs, and the endless chatter of television filling every waking hour. Cities no longer slept, they pulsed, they buzzed, they trembled beneath fluorescent halos. New York, London, Tokyo, each became a sleepless organism, breathing through exhaust and electricity. The night, once a time of intimacy and mystery, was now a stage of opportunity and danger. Crime thrived in the glow of half-lit streets. Sirens replaced lullabies, and the phrase, "the city that never sleeps," was no longer poetic, it was a diagnosis. In this restless age, the very rhythm of human life began to change. Workers clocked into night shifts, bars and diners stayed open till dawn, and television became a constant companion for those who couldn't close their eyes. Sleep was no longer sacred, it was negotiable, something to be traded, borrowed, or stolen. The dream researchers of earlier decades found themselves facing a paradox. The more they learned about the need for rest, the less society seemed to honor it. The brain, they discovered, required deep, unbroken sleep to repair itself, to dream. But culture demanded more production, more screens, more light. And so, in those glowing nights of the late 20th century, humanity began to divide itself. The sleepers and the watchers, the weary and the wired. Some found refuge in pills and prescriptions, others drowned their fatigue in city lights and caffeine. It was an age of insomnia disguised as progress, an era where no one wanted to close their eyes, afraid of missing what the modern world might do next.
Then came the turn of the millennium, a strange, glittering dawn. Skyscrapers rose like luminous dreams, their glass faces reflecting 1,000 sleepless souls. Cities, once choked by smoke, now shimmered with LEDs and screens. The hum of the industrial night became the gentle pulse of technology. The buzz of phones, the whisper of laptops, the quiet glow of routers like constellations across bedroom walls. Music changed, too. No longer confined to live halls or dusty records, it drifted into every private space. Lo-fi beats, ambient waves, and whispered playlists became the lullabies of a wired generation. Sleep, so long chased, medicated, and stolen, found a new language in sound. It was a paradoxical rebirth. We were never more connected, yet never more alone in our rooms. The glass around us, screens, windows, skyscrapers, became both sanctuary and barrier. The night was no longer dark, but painted in soft electric blue, and even silence carried a digital heartbeat. For some, this was freedom. They could work, dream, and create at any hour. For others, it was a trap, a world where the mind could not rest because the light never dimmed. The same devices that sang us to sleep could wake us with a single vibration. And yet, amid all that noise and neon, a quiet revolution began. People turned back towards stillness. Meditation apps, slow music, soft lamps, and stories meant not to excite, but to soothe. Humanity had circled back to something ancient, the desire to be gently led into the night, to surrender without fear. In glass towers and tiny apartments, a generation rediscovered what their ancestors had known, that to sleep is not to waste time, but to reclaim it.
You stand now in the present. The city hums beneath you like a living creature that never stops breathing. Cars slide through the wet streets, their reflections rippling through puddles like streaks of mercury. Neon billboards flash, not just selling dreams, but reminding you that time is currency, motion is survival. Even the sidewalks seem to move, delivery scooters weaving, people gliding by with earbuds, half listening to lives somewhere else. You realize this world has achieved what all those old civilizations tried to do, conquer the night. But in conquering it, we may have lost the peace it once promised. You think of the ancient Koreans pouring tea by lantern light, the moon mirrored in their cups, and wonder, when did we trade that stillness for a glow that never goes out? Every window tells a story. In one, a nurse prepares for her night shift, tying her hair with muscle memory. In another, a teenager edits videos under a blanket of LED stars. Somewhere, a baker kneads dough at 2 a.m. Somewhere else, a poet writes lines no one will read until morning. The city moves like a bloodstream, ceaseless, necessary, alive. Historians still argue whether we've become more awake or merely less able to rest, but you sense that rest itself has changed definition. It's not about stopping, it's about drifting inside motion, learning to be still while everything flows around you. And so, as dawn bleeds into the skyline again, you imagine the whole planet as one great teacup, steam rising, cities glowing beneath it. You sip from that image, quietly. The world will not stop, not tonight, not tomorrow, but you, somehow, find a way to rest inside its rhythm.
And now, as the city's hum settles somewhere far beyond your window, you feel the story easing to its end, like steam curling away from a forgotten cup. The people you've met tonight, monks and merchants, poets and generals, sleepy scholars under candlelight, they all blur into a quiet rhythm, one that's neither past nor present. It's just the steady sound of being alive. You imagine your breath matching the rise and fall of an ancient tea ceremony. Inhale, the kettle warms. Exhale, the world cools again. Somewhere in your mind, a door slides open, soft and deliberate. Lantern light spills across tatami mats, and for a moment you are both guest and ghost, watching history pour itself into silence. Maybe that's what these old rituals were always meant for. Not perfection, not prestige, but pause. A chance to remind ourselves that even the smallest motion, the lifting of a cup, the lowering of a gaze, can hold an entire universe. So, tonight, as you drift, let the steam of centuries wrap around you. Let each sound outside your room, each car, each whisper, each distant hum become part of that same endless tea, the kind that never cools, the kind that simply changes form. You've walked through empires and ruins, through noise and music, through cities that never sleep, and still, here you are, quiet, breathing, whole. The kettle empties, the night deepens, the story sighs, and you, finally, let go.